slow news, the citizens journalist counterpart to the biased and shallow copy-paste journalism of corporate media. Today we're going to have a look at the Nordstream 2 attacks, where there's now different reports blaming different parties for the attacks. We're going to follow the evidence to find out what is most likely true and who is most likely to blame. And we're going to have a look at what the Chinese balloon incident may have to do with the whole story. Stick with us, but if you're a fan of independent journalism, consider subscribing first. So on September 26, 2022, the Nordstream pipelines were blown up after having been the subject of criticism and controversy for many years. They were blown up near the Danish island of Bornholm. Especially US politicians have long criticized Nordstream as a Russian trap in order to hook Europe on cheap Russian gas. The blame game quickly erupted and started, and everyone was talking about sabotage. Many in the West blamed Russia initially. Russia, in the meantime, has sensed that the British Navy was behind the attacks. Sweden has launched an investigation into it. Sweden quickly determined that the pipelines exploded as a result of gross sabotage. But the Swedes would later deny sharing their findings with the Germans, saying that the information is highly classified. Now, Russia continued to push Sweden to reveal their findings openly. They also pushed at the United Nations to launch a separate investigation to the investigations that countries such as Sweden and Denmark, as well as Germany, had started on their own. And now we enter Seymour Hersh, the famous American investigative journalist who came out in February 23 claiming that he has received information that the United States and Norway are behind the attacks. Let's have a look at that. Now, Hersh is both renowned and feared since his past work included revealing the My Lai massacre in Vietnam and its cover-up in the Vietnam War, as well as his work covering the Watergate affairs, which led to the resignation of President Nixon. He's also known for several other important revelations regarding the CIA, the torture prison in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, and has received many awards, including the Pulitzer Awards and 5 George Polk Awards for his journalist work. Now let's have a look at Seymour Hersh's article. The story behind the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, according to investigative journalist Seymour Hersh. Hersh said that a source that was part of a highly secretive planning in Washington informed him of what had happened. When Russia amassed troops on Ukraine's border, President Biden asked the national security community, that included figures from the CIA and the administration, to come up with a solution to put an end to Nord Stream. Nord Stream is the name of several pipelines that went along the floor of the Baltic Sea, bypassing Ukraine and Poland and directly reaching Germany by sea. US politicians have seen Nord Stream as a Russian trap for a long time, given the fact that Putin sold liquefied natural gas to Germany at very cheap prices. The US believed Russia used this to hook Europe on liquid natural gas and thus gain influence over Western Europe. Nord Stream 1 has long been delivering gas to Europe. With Nord Stream 2, which would never open its pipes, that supply would have been doubled. Biden publicly stated before the war in Ukraine began that if Russia dared to invade Ukraine, there will be no Nord Stream 2. We will put an end to it, he said.
Since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control.
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
On September 26, 2022, the Nord Stream pipelines exploded and massive amounts of methane gas bubbled to the surface of the Baltic Sea. Hersh wrote that his source informed him that Navy divers recruited from the diving school that years ago started in Panama were given the task to plant C4 explosives under cover of the annual NATO exercise Baltops 22, in which numerous navies of NATO countries held an annual maneuver in the Baltic Sea on the 17th of June 2022. He said the US knew that they had to get the Norwegians on board, since the Norwegians hated Russia and had world-class sailors and divers and a very good knowledge of the area. The Norwegians were game and quickly found the ideal location off the Danish island of Bornholm, where the pipelines traversed shallow waters for several miles. The bombs were planted during Baltops 22. Top Danish and Swedish officials were briefed about diving activity in the region. On September 26, 2022 then, a Norwegian plane dropped a sonar buoy which triggered a timer, and a few hours later Nordstream was history and the world learned that something massive had happened. But is the United States truly behind Nordstream? Hersh, after all, also received criticism, for instance, by Bill Hurd, a former member of Congress, cybersecurity executive, and an undercover officer in the CIA. He has said that you are consuming too much Russian propaganda if you think that the United States is behind the attacks, since Biden did not even have the guts to send F-16s to Ukraine. So certainly William Hurd is right when he said that the Biden administration has tried to balance support for Ukraine with avoiding a direct conflict with Russia very carefully. But what do we in the public truly know? What do we make of all of that? What evidence do we have that we can follow to find out what is going on? So we can gather as much information about it as possible and then follow the available evidence to get us to the closest guess that we could possibly have. A former head of the German Bundesnachrichtendienst, which is the German intelligence, said in an interview with Die Welt that these attacks certainly are state-sponsored and there's numerous suspects because there's many states who have a possible motive. So Poland and Ukraine, for instance, want to keep the gas pipelines from Russia running through their lands instead of being bypassed through the Baltic Sea. Ukraine, of course, has no access to the Baltic Sea, but Poland sure does. And it did call for the end of Nord Stream already. Russia has stopped the gas supply to Europe and therefore breaching their contract, and by doing so risking a lawsuit and having to pay fines as a result of that. They're already in a legal battle with the European Union about this. Now, since the pipelines are history, they no longer have the possibility to supply the gas in the first place. It could also be that Russia gambled, that they wanted to sabotage US-European relations, making the Europeans believe that the United States are behind the attacks. The United States then has had a problem with Nord Stream for years, and several US politicians have announced that they want to put an end to Nord Stream. Biden even publicly said that Nord Stream 2 will be history. There will be no Nord Stream 2 if Russia dares to invade Ukraine.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
They also have drastically increased their sales of LNG gas to Europe since the end of the Russian pipeline and have made a lot of money with that. Norway then too is a major producer of oil and gas and has increased their exports to Europe in the aftermath of the Nord Stream sabotage and the Ukrainian war in general. So let's focus on Russia first. Is there any evidence that Putin blew up his own pipeline? As the Washington Post wrote, even Western officials doubt that Russia is responsible and say there is no conclusive evidence to blame the Russians. The Swedes who launched an investigation refused to share their findings with Germany and Russia, claiming it is classified information. Head of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, tweeted on September 27, 2022 that there will be a very severe reaction if it turns out to be sabotage. Nothing has happened ever since. This tweet has just been forgotten. So in addition to that, no Western country has come forward directly and said that they have evidence that makes a Russian involvement probable. In terms of a motive, it would be very dangerous for Putin and a very double-edged sword to carry out such attacks, since it was not only a golden pipeline with liquid gold for Russia, but also served as a weapon over Europe to get them hooked on cheap energy. And since Putin for the first time in many years has shown weakness, his seat is actually not as safe anymore as it used to be. And it would be very dangerous for him if the Russian elite found out that he is behind the attacks on Nordstream. Now let's move on to the NATO countries such as the United States, Norway and Poland, who also have a motive according to the former head of the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst. Leaving aside Seymour Hersh's article and leaving aside the fact that indeed UFO stories emerged coincidentally just in time when Hersh's article was released, and leaving aside the fact that US politicians wanted the pipeline gone for years, it is a fact that Biden announced with a smirk on his face that there will be no Nord Stream 2 if Russia invaded Ukraine. It is also a fact that Secretary of State Victoria Nuland said on camera that she's glad Nord Stream is now history.
Senator Cruz, like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea.
It's also a fact that Anthony Blinken called it a tremendous opportunity to end European dependency on Russian gas. A Polish politician even tweeted "Thank you, United States" after the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up. And just one day after Nord Stream ended, Norway opened their own pipeline heading through Danish waters into Poland. And of course, the primary economic beneficiaries are the US and Norway, who can now sell much more gas to Europe at higher prices than the Russians used to do. This even led to the French President Macron as well as German politicians complaining about the huge prices the United States demands for their gas. In addition to that, the UK said at the United Nations that they do not understand why Russia wants another investigation into Nord Stream, since there was already Denmark, Sweden and Germany who conducted their own investigations. With the Germans apparently having found that 6 people, presumably Ukrainians, rented a yacht with false passports and shipped from the haven of Rostock, Germany to the place where the bombs were planted. A joint team of journalists from the German state media ARD, the SVR and the Zeit said to have talked with numerous sources from within the European intelligence community, coming to the conclusions that the traces lead to Ukraine. It's important to note, however, that the journalists are basing their claims on sources not directly named and not available as Hersh did. And there is not an official statement of German intelligence or the German government or any other Western government stating that Ukraine is to blame for the attacks. Ukraine, of course, denied the whole thing, and it is difficult to think that Ukraine, who does not have access to the Baltic Sea, would be able to carry out such attacks without knowledge of the NATO countries and without their help or approval. Since Ukraine is completely dependent on Western help, it is highly unlikely that they would risk damaging these ties. So looking at all the evidence available, one thing is certain to me. Whether it was the Ukrainians who placed the bombs as revealed by the New York Times and the Zeit, or whether it was a joint operation by the United States and Norway, it is highly unlikely that Russia is behind the attacks. It happened in NATO waters, and whether Russians could pull off a secret sabotage without any one of the NATO countries noticing just in the NATO backyard is highly doubtful to me, since their military has not shown too much competence in Ukraine so far. It is also a very high risk for Putin at home, who is already fighting for his throne because of the fiasco in Ukraine. In my opinion, it is clear that this was most likely a NATO operation. It is possible the Ukrainians were recruited for the operation, but even if Ukraine had any involvement, it is unlikely that they could do so without any help from NATO countries. We're at the end of today's episode, guys. Thank you for sticking with me until the end. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel. And by the way, if there's anything that you're really interested about, send me an email to the address below with your suggestions, maybe some information. I'll check it out and can be your show. So that being said, see you again in about 2 weeks. Take care.